Is Samsung's new Odyssey G5 34-inch monitor a good option for more budget-conscious gamers after something ultra-wide and high refresh rate? Today, we do some in-depth testing to find out. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's monitor review time, and today I have in for testing the Samsung Odyssey G5 34, otherwise known by the far more painful name LC34G55T. This is the third option that's come out in Samsung's more budget-oriented G5 line after the 32 and 27-inch models that launched last year. The 34-inch variant we are looking at today has many of the same characteristics as those panels, just with an ultra-wide form factor and 3440 by 1440 resolution. Like all of Samsung's Odyssey products so far, we are looking at a 1000R curvature, which is more aggressive and more curved than most 21.9 ultra-wides on the market today, which typically use a curve between 1500R and 2000R. While I wasn't a fan of such a crazy curve on Samsung's Odyssey G7 in a standard 16:9 format, I think it works a lot better on a wider monitor such as the Odyssey G5 34. It is quite curved, which makes it better suited to gaming than creative work, but at this size, the curve isn't so pronounced that it's distracting. Other features included here are a VA panel and 165Hz maximum refresh rate. I'm very curious to see whether response times with this sort of combination come close to what we saw with the Odyssey G7 and G9, or whether it's more like a regular VA ultrawide, and we'll find out soon. There is adaptive sync support, of course, so compatibility with both AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync, and what Samsung describes as truly realistic HDR despite no hardware features to properly support HDR in any way. And before we dive into this one, pricing for the G5 does vary considerably depending on the region. In the US, it's priced around $600, but here in Australia, I've seen it for just 740 Aussie, which is less than the direct conversion of the US price. So when we talk about value later in the review, the final conclusion may vary a bit depending on which pricing setup applies in your region. From a design perspective, the G5 34 looks quite similar to Samsung's higher-end G7 products. Along the front edge there are these triangle grille sections which serve no purpose other than to create some visual interest, and on the back we get the same cool circular design. On the G7 both of these areas would have RGB LED lighting, but this has been omitted on the G5 to save costs. I don't think this is a significant omission at all, as RGB does absolutely nothing for me on a monitor. While I was quite pleased with the build quality on the G7, it has obviously been downgraded for the G5 in one key area: the stand. The lightweight, plasticky, cheap stand Samsung are using for this G5 is terrible. It feels low quality when you touch it, but also has an awful tilt mechanism which is difficult to operate, and that's the only range of motion provided here. In the end, the stand makes the panel sit quite low, so anyone needing extra height will need to fork out more for a VESA mount. Its legs are quite wide as well, although this isn't unusual for a 34-inch monitor. Unfortunately, this width is usually implemented to strengthen the stand and reduce wobble, but it doesn't do this with the G5 as the stand is still quite wobbly. On the rear you'll find a standard array of ports, one DisplayPort 1.4 and two HDMI 2.0. There's no extras here, so no USB hub or anything like that, although you do get a headphone jack, no built-in speakers. Samsung provides a decent OSD which is controllable through a directional toggle along the bottom edge of the display. In here you'll find a standard array of features including crosshairs and black boosting controls to help you cheat at gaming, plus some picture-in-picture modes and various color controls. Not the most comprehensive menu I've seen, but it's easy to control and includes most of the major features you'd normally want. For testing response times, Samsung offer 3 overdrive settings. However, if you are using the monitor with adaptive sync enabled, these options are disabled and you're left with just the one overdrive mode you can't change. This doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but it's similar to Samsung's past products. As such, I'm not going to bother testing all 3 modes and just stick to the performance when using adaptive sync, as that's how the vast majority of buyers will be using the G5 with a current generation GPU. At 165Hz, we see fairly typical VA performance with an average response time of 12.08 milliseconds. Overshoot is low for the most part, however some transitions here are very slow in the 20+ millisecond range and with high levels of cumulative deviation. As we talked about in our monitor testing update video for 2021, cumulative deviation measures how close a transition gets to the ideal instant response, and a score of over 1000 for any one transition is poor. What this means in practice is that the Odyssey G5 34 does have dark level smearing. We can see this in 2 areas. Any transitions that start in a darker shade of grey and rise to another shade of grey are slow. That's these transitions. Then over here we see slow fall times as well for a wide range of transitions. Basically any transition in the grayscale range that ends in a dark grey is going to present smearing and blur. While many people may be familiar with what dark level smearing looks like, it's worth looking at some Blurbuster's UFO test pursuit camera results so we can see how the numbers we've just looked at translate to the screen visually. Behind the UFO's red body in this image, you'll notice a dark black trail. That's the outer black edge of the UFO transitioning slowly up to the mid-blue background. Essentially what we're seeing here is that slow rise time from 0 to 128 for the middle row and 0 to 64 in the upper row. If we go back to the response time chart, we can see those slow transitions here. Slow fall times are seen more in this pursuit camera image, where there is a noticeable red ghost trail following the UFO's body. As the monitor transitions down from the bright red UFO to the medium grey background, we can see the slow fall times to medium grey present itself as a lingering red image on the screen. So hopefully this helps illustrate how the response time numbers we've measured affect the visual characteristics of the display. As we move through lower refresh rates, performance does improve. Response times get marginally faster, dark level smearing is reduced, and cumulative deviation also dips somewhat, although inverse ghosting increases. The monitor's best performance occurs around the 120 to 100 Hz range and then starts going the other way at lower refresh rates, particularly 60 Hz, which is similar in performance to 165 Hz. Given there is only one overdrive mode available when adaptive sync is active, there's no need to talk about the best overdrive mode because you can't change it. Ideally, I would have liked to see some adjustments possible just to tweak performance a bit further than what Samsung provides, but that's not possible. Compared to other monitors, what's immediately apparent is that the Odyssey G5 does not provide the same excellent response times we saw from the Odyssey G7 and G9. In fact, it appears at first glance as though Samsung are not using their newer panel technology here, which may come as a disappointment for people expecting a G7-like experience just at a lower refresh rate and with cuts to build quality and features. In fact, when comparing best grey-to-grey performance at the highest refresh rate, the Odyssey G5 delivers similar performance to other ultrawide VA panels that we've tested recently, like the Gigabyte G34WQC and AOC CU34G2X. This puts performance towards the bottom of our chart. When looking at average performance across the refresh range, the Odyssey G5 does move up a couple of spots, but not in a significant enough way to change the conclusion about performance. With the response time average around 10 milliseconds and a small amount of overshoot present, the G5 delivers typical VA-like performance that we've seen from a few generations of displays now, just with a 1000R curve and 165Hz refresh rate. This is made abundantly clear when viewing cumulative deviation results. The Odyssey G5's response behaviour is basically identical to that of the Gigabyte G34WQC in its deviation from the ideal response. It ends up slightly better than the Xiaomi Mi Curve 34 and AOC CU34G2X, but ultimately all four of these ultrawides are within 15% of one another. This puts the G5 behind a display like the LG 34GN850, which isn't unusual given the LG option uses a much more expensive IPS panel. Dark level smearing is an issue with the Odyssey G5 34, although again it's not necessarily worse than other VAs that we've tested. This is a typical result for a mid-range VA monitor, and ultimately it's one of the key trade-offs you have to make when choosing to buy a VA display. At a fixed 120Hz refresh rate, the Odyssey G5 performs to an acceptable level for a VA panel, although once again it isn't a high-performance monitor. And at 60Hz, again, these are very typical response times for a VA that we've seen for the last few years. Nothing out of the ordinary with input lag at 165Hz, although I did experience some weirdness at lower refresh rates depending on the refresh rate and whether you had adaptive sync enabled. However, if you are gaming with adaptive sync on, input lag is normal. Power consumption is also as expected for this sort of panel size and refresh rate. Samsung do offer a backlight strobing mode in their settings menu, which is accessible only at 165Hz with adaptive sync disabled. It doesn't work very well due to the panel's relatively slow response times and dark level smearing, leading to a prominent double image. The inflexibility of this mode and its mediocre performance means it's not something I would consider using. Moving now into colour performance, and the Odyssey G5 is your stock standard sRGB display, with sRGB gamut coverage a little below 100%, which is typical for a monitor that does not offer any wide gamut functionality. This is despite the monitor advertising HDR on the box. it doesn't actually support an HDR appropriate color gamut like DCI-P3. It's also in contrast to other ultrawide displays of this class, which typically offer around 85 to 90% P3 coverage. The good news is that without any wide gamut support, the Odyssey G5 does deliver respectable out-of-the-box color accuracy. In grayscale, Samsung have done a much better job than with their Odyssey G7, and while performance here isn't perfect, it's above average. You don't need to modify the black equalizer settings with this monitor to get a near accurate gamma, so that's nice. This flows into saturation performance with no obvious oversaturation, so we get a Delta E2000 result of 1.5, which is very solid, and overall accuracy is only impacted by a somewhat incorrect white point, and that's fixable in the OSD. Color checker results are also decent, again with a Delta E2000 average below 2.0. You can adjust things a little bit with OSD controls, but the main improvement from here is through a full calibration with an ICC profile. Results are as expected, and are quite good, especially because the software profile only needs to make minor adjustments to the color gamut. The fewer changes the ICC profile needs to make outside of grayscale, the more accurate of an experience you will get across a wide range of applications. Of this range of monitors, you'll see that Samsung provides superior color checker factory calibration to most of them, and that's down to Samsung only providing an sRGB gamut. This means that right out of the box, you'll see things like YouTube videos without significant accuracy problems. Grayscale performance is also above average, though less strong than the color checker results. Peak brightness is acceptable at around 330 nits, which is higher than Samsung's target of 250 nits listed on their spec sheet. Minimum brightness of 60 nits should be comfortable for many buyers that want to turn brightness down all the way. The big strength to the Odyssey G5 is its outstanding contrast ratio of nearly 4,000 to 1, delivering much deeper blacks than an IPS or TN monitor. This is a bit of a surprise given Samsung only lists contrast of 2500 to 1 on their spec sheet, which could be an error or just very conservative. And contrast is actually even higher before calibration in the 4500 to 1 range. This is a great result, although not that much better than the Xiaomi Mi Curve 34, which also has an excellent contrast ratio. It is noticeably higher than the Gigabyte G34WQC though. Viewing angles are limited by this panel's aggressive 1000R curve, so ultimately you'll want to sit in the middle to get the best experience. As for uniformity, the results presented by my review unit were okay, about what I'd expect for this sort of monitor, which is to say, somewhere in the middle of all results I've recorded. The good news is that grey uniformity was fine, much better than the Odyssey G7 in this regard. When Samsung says this monitor delivers truly realistic HDR, this is pure marketing BS. The Odyssey G5 only supports HDR inputs. It fundamentally lacks any HDR-capable hardware. Brightness isn't high enough, there is no local dimming support for increased contrast, and it doesn't support a wide color space. It is not an HDR monitor, and I would not recommend using it in an HDR mode, as it looks like garbage due to weird processing issues. Overall, the Samsung Odyssey G5 doesn't fundamentally change the conversation around 34-inch 3440 by 1440 ultra-wide VA monitors. What Samsung offering here is quite similar to what we've seen in these displays for a few years now, at a price point that's also quite similar. Sure, they have made this display more curved than before, but other than that, it's a typical mid-price ultra-wide. Response time performance is very close to what we've seen from similar 144Hz-ish 34-inch VA panels over the past year. This will disappoint those hoping Samsung would introduce their excellent VA tech used in the Odyssey G7 at a lower price point, but fundamentally, this is their prior generation technology, which is usually what happens for mid-range displays. Generally, this is both a good and bad thing. What's good is that despite not being able to change overdrive settings when using FreeSync, performance is generally competitive with similar displays like the Gigabyte G34WQC and AOC CU34G2X. However, as it's an older gen VA panel, dark level smearing is present, so performance is mediocre compared to the overall monitor market. In what is a typical story for a VA panel, what Samsung isn't able to produce in response times is made up for with above average color performance. Factory calibration is great thanks to an sRGB only nature of this panel. If you really want wide gamut, this won't be the monitor for you and you should look to a competitor's product, but for modern SDR gaming panels, I actually think this approach ends up better, especially as most brands are unable to figure out proper sRGB emulation modes. On top of that, you get an excellent contrast ratio that's well above what Samsung advertises in the spec sheet. So on the balance of things, nothing overly exciting here, just your typical VA ultrawide with some of the usual strengths and weaknesses. The only major downside I see that Samsung probably should have done a better job of is the awful stand, which is way worse than something like the G34WQC from Gigabyte that provides proper height adjustment. What is going to make or break the Odyssey G534 is the price. In a region like Australia, Samsung are being reasonably competitive but aren't offering the best value. The Odyssey G5 is only 6% more expensive than the G34WQC, but AOC are undercutting both right now with the C34G2X at just $600. I imagine in some other regions this situation could flip and any one of these monitors ends up the cheapest, which makes sense as they're all very similar in performance. Where Samsung has kind of failed in pricing is in the US. The Odyssey G534 is being sold there for a whopping $600 which is already $150 more than Gigabyte's G34WQC and $100 more than the CU34G2X. That's not a competitive price and really needs to be below $500 at a start. Hopefully, if you are watching this video, say in 6 months, pricing is much more suitable, which I think it could be given this is a new product and usually pricing does adjust over time. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Samsung Odyssey G534. If you're interested in supporting our display testing and you want to get things like the ICC profile we generate during our review process or access to our Discord community where you can ask us questions, then you can sign up to our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. Links to those are in the description below. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.